What if I told you that a few American bombers flying over the Atlantic could change the course of global power? Sounds exaggerated, right? But that's exactly the kind of signal Washington and NATO are trying to send to Moscow. And the rest of the world is watching carefully. Let's start with what actually happened. Recently, the U.S. Air Force deployed B-1B Lancer bombers across the Atlantic, training alongside NATO allies in Norway and other northern regions. To the casual observer, it might seem like just another military exercise, planes in the sky, soldiers on the ground, allies practicing together. And that's exactly how mainstream outlets frame it, as routine, defensive, nothing to worry about, just friends keeping their skills sharp. But here's what they don't tell you. Behind the staged photos and carefully worded press releases lies a much deeper strategy. These flights are not about training alone. They're about deterrence, projection of power, and sending an unmistakable message to Vladimir Putin. We are here, and we are ready. Think about the timing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has dragged on for more than 2 years. Moscow has thrown enormous resources into its war machine. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, billions of rubles, and an endless stream of propaganda. And yet, despite all this, the front lines remain stubbornly deadlocked. Ukraine continues to resist, Western weapons keep flowing in, and the Kremlin has been forced to admit, at least tacitly, that victory is far from guaranteed. In this context, the sudden appearance of American strategic bombers so close to Russia's northern flank is no coincidence. It's a reminder that NATO's reach is global, that its resources are vast, and that if Russia dares to test the alliance beyond Ukraine, the response will be overwhelming. Of course, the official NATO line is always the same. These are defensive measures. We seek no confrontation. We only want to preserve stability. That's the script. But let's peel it back. What's really happening here is the old playbook of great power politics. The U.S. is demonstrating that it can project power across oceans at will, reinforcing its allies and positioning itself as the ultimate guarantor of European security. In other words, America wants Russia to know who still calls the shots. But here's where it gets interesting. While the media portrays these maneuvers as a show of unity and strength, they rarely mention the risks. Because every bomber in the sky, every warship crossing into contested waters, every troop deployment along the Russian border increases the chances of miscalculation. A radar glitch, a nervous pilot, a misunderstood signal, suddenly the world is staring at the possibility of a NATO-Russia clash that nobody really wants. And let's not forget the history. During the Cold War, Washington and Moscow staged countless displays of military muscle. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962? A single deployment of Soviet missiles to Cuba nearly triggered nuclear war. Remember Able Archer in 1983 when NATO exercises convinced the Kremlin that a real attack might be imminent? In both cases, what was intended as deterrence nearly spiraled into disaster. So when you see sleek footage of American bombers flying in tight formation, don't just admire the choreography. Ask yourself, how many times has a show of force come dangerously close to unleashing catastrophe? But here's what they don't tell you in today's headlines. These operations aren't only about Russia. They're about reminding Europe who really holds the balance of power. NATO may present itself as an alliance of equals, but in reality, it is Washington that pays the bills, supplies the most advanced weapons, and decides when and where to flex muscle. The Europeans, Germany, France, even Britain, might grumble about autonomy, but when push comes to shove, they follow America's lead. So in that sense, a bomber flight is not just a message to Moscow, it's a message to Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and Oslo too. Don't even think about drifting away, your security still depends on us. And yet beneath the surface, contradictions are piling up. Europe is being asked to massively increase military spending at a time when social services are under pressure and economies are slowing. Billions are being poured into tanks, jets, and ammunition factories, while ordinary citizens face rising costs of living and shrinking welfare states. The media frames it as sacrifice for freedom, but who really benefits? Arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Rheinmetall are reporting record profits. NATO expansion has been a bonanza for the military-industrial complex. Meanwhile, Russia, despite sanctions and economic isolation, continues to adapt. It deepens ties with China, with India, with the broader BRICS bloc. Its oil and gas still find markets, its defense industry keeps churning out weapons, and its propaganda machine tells its citizens that the West is the true aggressor. In this narrative, every American bomber flight confirms Putin's story. We are under siege by NATO, and we must fight back. That narrative keeps his population mobilized, fearful, and obedient. So ask yourself, does this strategy really weaken Russia, or does it strengthen Putin's grip at home? Now let's zoom out even further. The U.S. insists that these deployments are temporary, that they're about preserving peace. But history shows us that temporary deployments often become permanent footprints. American bases in Germany, Italy, and Japan were supposed to be short-term after World War II. 8 decades later, they're still there. So when bombers train in Norway or when troops rotate through Poland and the Baltics, how long before those rotations quietly transform into permanent garrisons? How long before NATO's eastern border becomes a militarized frontier that future generations simply accept as normal? But here's what they don't tell you in the glossy NATO press releases. Every new base, every new exercise, every new deployment increases dependency. Smaller countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become ever more reliant on Washington's umbrella, while their ability to pursue independent foreign policy shrinks. It's not just defense, it's alignment, it's submission, it's the quiet erosion of sovereignty. And let's be brutally honest, the real danger is not just war with Russia, but the way constant militarization reshapes our societies. Imagine what else those resources could fund. Green energy transitions, universal health care, affordable housing. Instead, we are told that endless spending on weapons is the only path to safety. Who decided that? Who benefits when entire economies are reoriented around preparing for perpetual war? Now, none of this is to downplay the brutality of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Moscow's aggression is undeniable, and Ukrainians are paying a horrific price. But acknowledging that truth does not mean blindly accepting NATO's framing. Two things can be true at once. Russia's invasion is criminal, and the West's militarized response risks locking us into a dangerous cycle that enriches elites, while ordinary people shoulder the costs. So where does this leave us? The bombers flying over the Atlantic may look like symbols of strength, but they are also symbols of fear. Fear that the war in Ukraine could spill over, fear that Russia might test NATO's resolve, fear that without constant shows of force, the fragile balance could crumble. And fear, when combined with profit motives and historical rivalries, is a combustible mix. Here's the bottom line. Every flight, every drill, every deployment is part of a larger psychological game, a game meant to reassure allies, intimidate adversaries, and convince populations back home that their leaders are in control. But history teaches us that these games often spin out of control. And when nuclear powers are involved, the stakes couldn't be higher. So, the next time you see footage of NATO exercises or hear pundits talk about deterrence, remember to ask, deterrence for whom and at what cost? Who gains power and who pays the price? Because the truth is, ordinary people, whether in Ukraine, Russia, or Europe, are the ones who bleed while generals, politicians, and CEOs play their dangerous games. And maybe that's the most important takeaway. Peace through strength may sound noble, but peace through dialogue, justice, and cooperation is the only real alternative to endless escalation. Yet that's the path we almost never hear about in mainstream coverage. Why? Because peace doesn't sell weapons. Peace doesn't justify trillion-dollar defense budgets. Peace doesn't keep populations obedient. So let me leave you with this question. How long will we allow fear and profit to dictate the future of global security? And how many bomber flights, how many troop movements, how many temporary deployments will it take before we realize that the path we're on leads not to peace, but to permanent tension? If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to hit that subscribe button, follow the channel, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the hidden truths behind the headlines. Because in a world of endless propaganda, staying informed is the only way to stay free.